Hey guys, welcome back to Falcons Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host, Matt Karoly. Today we are going to be breaking down some film from the Falcons' Week 14 win over the Carolina Panthers. We'll be looking ahead to their upcoming Week 15 matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. But as we often do on this show, we start things off talking about some of the latest news with the Falcons. They always seem to give us some help with that by making some roster moves on Tuesday. We'll get into that later on today's episode. But the reason why they made some roster moves was because they had a couple of major injuries with wide receiver Calvin Ridley as well as cornerback Desmond Trufant going on IR. Matt, talk about sort of what those injuries mean, not only for this game, but also for the rest of the season. And I'm sure at some point we'll eventually sort of circle things back around, and particularly with Desmond Trufant, talk a little bit about maybe what it means for his future beyond this season.
Yeah, we'll talk about Calvin Ridley first because there's a little bit more to unload with Trufant's injury. But yeah, it stinks for Calvin. It was when the injury was first broken during the game, I was a little concerned because when you hear a guy kind of just falling to the sideline, as the commentators said, you kind of pause and be like, all right, well that doesn't sound good. He had an abdomen injury. I guess the good news is Dan Quinn mentioned on Monday if there was more than 3 games left that Calvin would be back this season. So it doesn't sound like something that's, would have kept them out for more than, 3-4 games. But because we're in week 15 at this point, they're going to shut him down and let him get a head start on that recovery and, look to 2020. So again, it's a big loss for this offense, because outside of Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley is that only other deep vertical threat that can test, the entire field. And test the entire defense. We'll see if Alamany Zaccheaus, who had that nice, memorable 93-yard touchdown, maybe he gets some more looks and can be that other guy. But until we see it consistently, this is certainly going to be a loss. And, guys like Austin Hooper now, who kind of eased himself back into action last week, is going to have to ramp it up in a hurry and get back to that peak level form that he showed earlier in the season, because they're going to need that second target for sure, next to Julio Jones. As for Desmond Trufant, again, it's unfortunate for him because he was playing so well, returning off that toe injury, and now he has another season-ending injury to his resume. And again, the guy's going to turn 30 in September next year. He's got 3 years left on his deal with, about $35 million, I think it is. So there's going to be some questions about, is this the end of the line for Desmond Trufant? I think we touched on it briefly on a previous show that, the Falcons are obviously going to have to be pretty aggressive with some cap restructures, and there's only so many options you can do that with. And I think we also mentioned on that show that while Jake Matthews is one of those options, they're going to have to wait till September to do that based on the whole 1-year rule in the collective bargaining agreement. You can't restructure a contract more than once in a calendar year. So because they did it in September of this year, they're going to have to wait till September of next year to do it again. So Desmond Trufant could be safe for those reasons. It's tough to know for sure until we know what the current regime or the new regime that's likely going to be brought in decides to do. But that's certainly a question I have. Not just in the current, how are they going to replace him, but they might have to look long-term now for a guy that's, suffering another injury. He's going to be 30 years old and has a pretty high cap hit for a team that's, tight on cap space at the moment. They can certainly get out of it, but in order to do so, they're either going to have to cut players or, restructure them. So that'll be something to monitor throughout. And this injury certainly adds another wrinkle to that question.
I think circling back a little bit to Calvin Ridley, and if you're a regular viewer or a regular listener of this podcast, one of the things that we talked about earlier in the season when the offense was struggling during that first month or so of the year was sort of how they were using Calvin Ridley and how essentially ineffective the Falcons offense was without having him sort of step up, because, everybody's focused on Julio Jones. And then when you have players like Austin Hooper, Mohamed Sanu, and Calvin Ridley being able to make plays with the single coverage that they're getting, that's sort of the key to success with the Falcons offense. And the problem was, because of all the dink and dunking that they were doing, it was leading to Sanu and Hooper putting up numbers from a catch standpoint, but they weren't generating as many big plays as they needed to. And so you're sort of getting that classic sort of, New Orleans Saints offense, where you're just sort of dinking and dunking your way down the field. And not pushing the ball down the field. And that makes things easier for the defenses to defend. And then when we've seen in a lot of the games this season where Ridley has stepped up, including the first half of this past week's Carolina game, and sort of been that lead guy, you've seen this offense look a lot better. Obviously, the offense was able to do a lot more things, and we'll get into that later on in today's episode. So my concern with the Ridley injury is, without that presence there, you go back to sort of what Matt was talking about, kind of have to rely on Austin Hooper to sort of have to carry the load. And you do need some of these young players to at least present the threat that will at least make teams pay for all the attention that they're going to give for Julio Jones and all the attention that they're going to give to Austin Hooper. And we saw that last week again with Zacchaeus making that play, but you're going to need that from Zacchaeus. You're going to need that from Blake. You're going to need that from Gage. You're going to need a couple of plays. And it's going to be even more problematic because the way this 49er team with their pass rush, it kind of forces you to have to kind of dink and dunk, because you got to get the ball out quickly, because otherwise they're going to be able to pin their ears back. And so it doesn't really play to the strength. So you're going to need guys like Hooper and Zacchaeus and all these guys, Gage, to really do the bulk of the work after the catch, which we know has been an issue for this offense. I think, I forget where they rank in terms of the least amount of yards after the catch, but it's pretty low this season. And so that's going to have to change this week if this team is going to have really any shot to stay competitive with this 49er team. But we'll get deeper into that matchup. As for Trufant, I do think, to a certain extent, at least some of the talk surrounding him in this injury, having another injury, can be overblown. It's a broken arm. It's not that big a deal. It's sort of a freak injury type of thing that should have little to no issue healing. It's probably, besides a broken finger, probably the least consequential injury that you can have as a professional football player. I mean, at least you can make that argument. I'm sure maybe some trainers and doctors would disagree with me on that. But it is one of those injuries that's just like, oh, you broke a bone, it heals. No big deal. So I don't think anybody should be like, oh, well, Trufant, maybe he's injury prone. Pump the brakes on that to a certain extent. And, I think what's interesting with Trufant, particularly when you talk about cutting him, I think the Falcons can save about $5 million, a little shy of $5 million against the cap. But one of the things we talked about on this podcast is, like, if you do a simple restructure, and I use air quotes when I say simple, you can save upwards of like $6.5 million. So your first choice shouldn't be releasing Desmond Trufant. Your first choice should be restructuring him, and only in the event that for some reason he balks at that, which, again, with this simple restructuring, he isn't taking a pay cut. He's getting paid the exact same amount of money. You're just moving money into future years rather than.
It'll guarantee his spot more, or at least, increase the likelihood of increasing his spot on the roster in 2021. So I don't see why he would balk at it. That's why a lot of players do it, is because, again, you're getting more money up front, and you're also guaranteeing more of your future. So it's a good move for both parties if, again, you're not concerned with the future aspect, because that's the only concern I would have with that, is then at age 31, 2021, it makes it tougher to get out of that deal. I mean, they can certainly do it, but that's the concern with that.
I think, I think that's a good point. And I think really right now, I think you can be relatively confident that Trufant can come back in 2020 and play at a decent level. Whether or not, he starts to show some decline and starts to look like the player that we saw in that Titans game and that Texans game where he was struggling a little bit, more frequently, okay, that's certainly up in the air. But certainly, as you mentioned, he's played really well this season. And so one would hope that there isn't going to be much of any decline in his age 30 season next year. To me, the question right now, when we're talking about like 2021 and beyond, is you're really talking about whether or not the Falcons have another option. Because if Desmond Trufant is still your, number one corner at that point, you're going to be less inclined to move on from him that far in the future. And, that speaks to sort of, talk of draft stuff and whether you draft a cornerback early in this draft that has that sort of number one corner potential, whether or not the new coaching staff gets more out of Isaiah Oliver or Kendall Sheffield or sort of those things. All of that to say is, I think in terms of concerned about Desmond Trufant beyond the 2020 season, I think at this point in time, if you're the Falcons, you just basically have to take an approach of we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, as opposed to being too worried about putting yourself in a situation today that may or may not be detrimental, just basically guessing as opposed to, they need to be more concerned about sort of the immediate. And I think having Desmond Trufant back on the roster for as cheap as possible is well worth the potential risk of being saddled with a contract in 2021 that you might have to eat to a certain extent. That's my take.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was a betting man and placed money on it, I'd say he's definitely going to be back in 2020. Again, it'll be interesting what they do, what the new defensive coordinator's style is like. Because, again, I'd rather them not have to restructure him. I'd rather them dip into someone else, whether it be Grady Jarrett or moving Julio's money around, maybe even restructure Deion Jones. I'd rather them restructure guys that are going to be around the next 3-4 years than a guy in Trufant where there's a lot of uncertainty. But if they restructure it, I mean, again, it makes sense. I get it, because that's what they need to do to be at least, spenders in any sense of the word. I don't think fans should get the idea that because they're going to make these restructuring moves just to have cap space, they're still not going to be big spenders. If anything, at most they'll be medium spenders. Again, they have to. Part of the problem these last couple of years is they were medium spenders then, but they just threw money around just to kind of throw it around, and they got to pick and choose their battles a little bit better. But again, it'll be a fascinating development. Again, he's one of the players to watch as far as, what the new regime decides to do with him, because they got a couple other corners that are certainly going to get some more looks in Sheffield and Oliver, and hopefully Miller gets some looks now in Trufant's absence. So again, in a lost season like this, although you never like to see guys get hurt, it now presents an opportunity where you can really evaluate a guy like Jordan Miller. And again, Isaiah Oliver went out with an injury, so that's another thing worth talking about and bringing up, something to monitor throughout the week, because if he's out, then again, you're definitely going to see Jordan Miller step into a role on the outside, probably a nickel set. So again, while we hate to see Trufant go for the remainder of the year, it does give an opportunity to evaluate some more of these younger guys and see what you have with them going into 2020.
Yeah. And on that note, the Falcons did shore up, or at least attempt to shore up, some of their cornerback depth by signing veteran corner Jamar Taylor today. They also promoted linebacker Ahmad Thomas from the practice squad to the roster. Essentially, he's taking Jermaine Grace's roster spot. In a perfect world, at least the world that Matt and I would have built, we would have just re-signed Jermaine Grace, but it is what it is. What would we be if the Falcons ever made us happy on a consistent basis? We wouldn't be Falcon fans. But anyway, Jamar Taylor is a guy that's sort of been a journeyman nickel corner, has bounced around the league, been with Cleveland and Miami and several other teams. I think he was most recently with Seattle earlier this season. He's not been the world's best nickel cornerback, particularly when you look at his Pro Football Focus grades. His best season came about in 2016 with the Browns. He was decent there in Cleveland for a couple of seasons. He's basically a depth guy. I'm reminded of, was it last year or 2 years ago, where the team picked up Leon McFadden late in the year, and he was just kind of hanging out on the bench for the last couple of weeks, and then maybe got a couple of garbage time reps or something like that. I think that's the plan with Jamar Taylor, but he does give them some depth, particularly on the inside. If you're going to have Kendall Sheffield playing a lot more outside corner with Trufant out, you have Bleedy Ray Wilson, who can play some nickel as well. So I would suspect that, their plan B at the nickel cornerback spot would be Bleedy Ray over Jamar Taylor. And then, of course, you still have DeMonte Casey as sort of your plan C there. But, of course, in order for them to get the plan C, that would probably require them to have to decide to play Sherrod Niesman. But we know that's not going to happen. So plan C is really plan Z at this point in time. But Jamar Taylor, I guess maybe you could say he might be plan C or plan D as far as the team's depth goes. But you're right, with the Oliver injury, that's something to keep an eye on, particularly if you're stuck in a situation where Sheffield and Bleedy Ray are going to play outside or Sheffield and is going to play outside, then that gives an opportunity for Jordan Miller, as you mentioned. I always forget that Jordan Miller's on the team. And then Bleedy Ray potentially playing inside or flipping that with Kendall Sheffield. But Taylor gives you a little bit more depth there on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we want to run into a situation where we really have to play Jamar Taylor. I think you kind of summed him up pretty well. I mean, he's a journeyman. He got beat out this year by a rookie, Amada from Oregon that Seattle drafted in the 4th round. So, again, he's in there for depth. And I agree, he's in there for depth at nickel corner so that they don't have to ever really move DeMonte Casey back down there, since he's been playing pretty well at free safety now. So again, just a depth move just to fill out the roster. But at this point, their top 4 corners are going to be Sheffield, Bleedy Ray, Isaiah Oliver, and Jordan Miller, likely in that order. So again, hopefully no more injuries there, and we can see those guys and evaluate them. Evaluate especially, like I said, Jordan Miller, because I think, I've always been high on him, as loyal listeners of the show know. I thought he was one of their more underrated picks. I do think he has potential to be a potential top 3 corner on this team in the future. And, hopefully we get to see a little bit of that these last 3 games. So again, the Taylor and Thomas signing, I totally forgot about the possibility of bringing back Jermaine Grace back. So that you just kind of triggered me, Aaron, more and maybe a little bit more mad that they decided to promote Ahmad Thomas instead of just bringing back Jermaine Grace. But, we kind of gave our thoughts pretty in depth on last week's show. So for those that missed that, go back and take a look at that. But nothing really much more to add here. I mean, again, just filling out the roster, knock on wood, there's no more injuries, and, we can roll with the secondary as is. I think the one main thing, though, I do want to talk about roster-wise, the biggest story for me that, occurred early Sunday when we got the inactive list was the fact that Jamon Brown was a healthy scratch at guard. And I know we kind of had a little conversation before the game on Twitter about this, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts now because, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it was kind of your stance that you didn't think the fact that Brown being inactive had anything to say, or it wasn't an indictment on Thomas Dimitroff, but more an indictment just on Dan Quinn. So if you can kind of elaborate why you think that is and why you don't think Dimitroff deserves any blame for the offseason signings of Brown and Carpenter, and the fact that his $12 million guaranteed man guard is no longer seeing the field despite being healthy.
Well, the easy explanation, that may be a little bit too much of an easy explanation, is I don't think Dimitroff makes roster decisions. I think he is involved in roster decisions. He consults on roster decisions, but I think ultimately every roster decision is under the purview of Dan Quinn. And I think essentially what Dimitrov does is he sort of runs the scouting department. And, particularly when it comes to the draft, is in charge of looking for the guys that fit the Falcons' needs. But I think ultimately, again, I think Dan Quinn has a considerable amount of influence on this. Not to sit here and say that Dan Quinn is out there dictating exactly what the Falcons are doing from a roster standpoint, and particularly with the draft. But it is telling to me that when you look at how often the Falcons draft all-star game guys, which is really the first opportunity that the coaches get to look at guys, I think kind of tells you a lot there. Obviously, we're talking about the draft and versus free agency, but I don't think there's any reason to think that suddenly Thomas Dimitrov sort of asserts his will when it comes to free agency that he doesn't necessarily assert during the draft process. So it's not to sit here and say that, oh, Dimitrov has done a great job or anything. Like, he's got 12 years of a body of work that you can certainly poke any number of holes in, particularly those first 7. But I just really feel like the last 5 years, when it comes to who deserves the bulk of the criticism for roster mistakes, I think that's Dan Quinn. And so if we're looking at Jamon Brown being a healthy scratch and saying that's an indictment of this organization or this front office or whatever the case may be for making a terrible decision, which again, I think is a questionable conclusion to reach, because we've had this conversation, on this show and certainly on Twitter over whether or not Jamon Brown is deserving of that type of criticism, is deserving of being benched. So again, that's a separate conversation. But the too long didn't read version is, I just don't think Dimitrov really makes any decisions or really has any power. So I think a lot of the criticism he's gotten, particularly in the last several weeks in this year, isn't really deserved, because to me, he's kind of the lieutenant and not the general / colonel or whoever, admiral that's sort of running the Army, running the Navy type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, to address that last point about whether Brown deserves all the criticism he gets and deserves this benching, again, as you said, we talked about it. I fully agree. I don't think he should have been. I mean, he seems to be taking the fall, and guys like James Carpenter are getting the pass. So that I'd place at the feet of Dan Quinn, self-scouting his offensive linemen and the players that he has on his roster. But again, if you're not, and I go back to the quotes that, made headlines in the offseason about Dimitrov, making a vow to Arthur Blank that he wasn't going to allow what happened last year with the offensive line to happen again. But yet here we are kind of doing a carousel of offensive linemen in there to see what works and what doesn't work. We're at the same point. So that's where, for me, I feel like you have to place some blame at Thomas Dimitrov's doorstep, because again, it's a partnership with Dan Quinn, as I've said before on this show. If you can't place any blame for the moves that this team makes in free agency, then what's he bringing to the table? What can you place blame with him on? I mean, again, you pointed out you can pick holes throughout his 12-year tenure, but it doesn't sound like at this point you're allowed to poke any holes, because Dan Quinn is kind of fully in charge of everything that happens with this roster.
I mean, look, I'm not sitting here saying like Dimitrov has done nothing wrong or anything like that. It's just, I feel like he's getting credit or being discredited, if maybe that's the right word, for things that he's not necessarily in charge of. Like, I just don't think he's really in charge of anything. I think he's just kind of second fiddle in this organization. Now, I'm not, again, don't get it twisted, guys. I'm not sitting here saying that, and that means, well, he shouldn't be fired or whatever. If you think he should be fired, then that's your opinion. Run with it. Look, there's been many years. If you just look at the hashtag Dimitrov on Twitter, you're going to find like 85% of those tweets are from me being very critical of Thomas Dimitrov. It's just, I don't necessarily know if the failure of the offensive line falls at his feet, directly at his feet. Let me just say, like, it's at Dan Quinn's feet, and Dimitroff is sort of peeking around the edge, like, hey, I'm here too. I don't know. I don't think he's directly responsible for certain things. I just think he's part of the situation. Obviously, he certainly, as you mentioned, is a partner of Dan Quinn, but I kind of think he's in the passenger seat, or if he's driving the car, so to speak, it's Dan Quinn that's running the GPS and giving him directions. He's just kind of the guy steering and hitting the gas, which gives him some responsibility, but he's not the guy that's, getting us to the destination, so to speak.
So, I mean, you think then the offseason moves as far as the signings of Jamon Brown, James Carpenter, and Tyson Braylow was more the work of Dan Quinn, and Thomas Dimitroff just kind of carried out that plan. That's what I'm getting.
Yeah, that's it. I think every roster move that the Falcons make is ultimately Dan Quinn's decision. I think there are times where Dimitroff gets leeway to sort of run with it, and Dan Quinn gives him, relatively speaking, a long leash to do things like we got this season with the trade negotiations and whatnot. I'm sure Dan Quinn wasn't necessarily involved talking to GMs while he's sitting here trying to run practices to negotiate trades and whatnot. And he's not involved in terms of how much guys get paid or whatever. But I certainly think that Dan Quinn was sort of spearheading the decision to go out there and get guys like Carpenter, who he coached in Seattle, along with Chris Morgan. I think Dan Quinn was probably wanting to go out there and get a physical guy. Maybe you can say Dimitroff then sort of looked at the free agent market and said, like, we think Jamon Brown is the best option for us to get a guy at our price point. Maybe then I think you can maybe put blame on Dimitroff in that regard. But, I don't think Dimitroff was out there sitting here pounding the table for the Falcons to re-sign Tyson Braylow. So it's just one of those things where I'm not sitting here saying that Dimitroff is absolved of any blame for the Falcons' issues. I just don't know if he's at fault for them in the way that I think he often gets criticized for.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the inactive stuff, that's on the coach. But I mean, it is an interesting perspective because we did say, I think on last week's show, that I'm still unsure of what's going to happen at general manager. I think we're all pretty confident what's going to happen at head coach, but again, the general manager I think is still very much up in the air. I know there's been a couple articles I've seen and read out there that from league insiders and whatnot, thinking that there's a good chance Dimitroff's done, but again, if the offensive line and defensive line stuff, if you can actually place that on Dan Quinn, then again, because that's the one thing, you see fans all the time saying about Dimitroff is, he hasn't been able to address the trenches the way it needs to be addressed. If these last several years that the reason for that is Dan Quinn getting in the way, then again, Thomas Dimitroff kind of gets absolved from a lot of stuff. And, if the next head coach is willing to work with him, then maybe Dimitroff gets a third crack at this with a different head coach. Because again, Arthur Blank has never, as we've said many times, has never fired a general manager, and he usually just repositions him somewhere else in the front office like he did with Rich McKay. So again, it's another interesting storyline that we'll get into much, much more in the coming weeks. But that's why I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because again, as I've said, I consider them a partnership. So I thought they'd be working hand in hand, but you just never know. And we kind of saw it a little bit towards the end of Smitty's tenure, where there's reports that there was a little disconnect as far as, one wanting to go one way with the defensive line and Mike Smith wanted to go with the big beefy guys in the middle. Maybe again, we're seeing another parallel from the end of Smitty's tenure and the end of Quinn's tenure. So again, something to monitor. As I said, I don't think it's a done deal as far as the GM is concerned. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. But yeah, let's get into the All-22, I guess. Finally some good positive stuff to talk about after another win. It's too bad the Falcons can't play these Panthers every week because, it's crazy. I'm surprised that they have 5 wins based on what we've seen from them these last 2 weeks and what we've seen from Kyle Allen. I mean, again, we're seeing him kind of fall back down to earth. The first couple outings of him, he was good with the football, took care of it, and now we're seeing the exact opposite. And it was a very carbon copy-esque performance, in my opinion. The one difference, and we're going to highlight here with Davante, the only difference really that I saw from this game was just the fact that the running game went off. And, I think a lot of it had to do with, the Panthers coming in with the worst run defense. But in a couple of plays here, we saw some vintage Devonta Freeman stuff that we saw when he was at his peak, from 2015 to 2017. The blocking was, for the most part, good. But on this play here that Aaron's going to run, the blocking was not so good. But you'll see Devonta Freeman turned what would have been a 0 gain into a positive gain play.
Yeah, pretty simple, 4-yard gain. You'll see it better from the end zone angle where Chris Lindstrom. Sorry, of course, this always happens. Chris Lindstrom, the right guard, here will get pushed back from, I think, Vernon Butler. That will sort of disrupt the play, prevent Keith Smith from making his block. But Devontae makes a nice little jump cut outside, avoids Gerald McCoy, Matt's favorite defensive tackle, and turns in a nice positive 4-yard gain. Matt, do you have anything you want me to run it back one more time? Or are you ready to move on to the next one?
No, I think that was good. Again, that's Devontae's patented move, that jump cut. That's what made him the top 5 running back. What gave him that contract is being able to turn, sometimes when it wasn't there, into a positive game, and he did that there. We're going to see it again here. This one was even better. You'll see Trey Boston creeping down into the box, and Devontae's going to put one heck of a move on him. Boom, boom, and there he goes, hits the hole. Again, should have been a no gainer. He turns it into a 10-yard gain. Here's another great angle of that. So you got 2 Devontae jump cuts on that one.
Yeah, pretty much. This is classic Devontae.
Yeah, I mean, again, for all the people, and again, I've admitted to on Twitter that I thought he lost a step. He certainly it's almost like he read the tweets type moment where, again, he looked like every bit the type of player that he was from 2015 to 2017. So it was exciting to watch. Hopefully we can get a little bit more of that. It's going to be a much more stiffer test going against 49ers run defense. But again, these 2 plays we highlighted here, the blocking wasn't, perfect, but Devontae made guys miss in the open field. And if he can continue to do that, he can continue to stack performances like he did this past week versus Carolina.
Yeah, and before we move on to talk about everybody's other favorite player on this team, it's probably not a coincidence that when you go back and look at this season that Devontae had some of his best games against some of the weaker run defenses that he's faced. I think the Jaguars are now currently 32nd in rushing defensive DVOA, so that's another opportunity for him to highlight. But it is nice to sort of see like the idea that the demise of Devonta Freeman has been at times greatly exaggerated. But since we're talking about, players that have gotten a lot of heat this season from the fans playing well, let's highlight another player that has gotten a lot of heat from the fans this season also playing well. And if you can't tell from this play, we're talking about Vic Beasley. And this was a nice pass rush from Vic Beasley on the edge. It led, it didn't stop anything, but I'll cede the floor to Matt to highlight what he wants to talk about on this play.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see right when he's going to click it, Vic Beasley executing a double swipe move. Again, when I first saw it, watching it live, it was almost unrecognizable to me that this was Vic Beasley because pass rush moves has not been his friend as far as developing one. He's been a one-trick pony speed rusher, but here on Dennis Daly, I mean, he executes this move flawlessly. This was actually a move, we saw Cam Jordan kind of, whip Caleb McGarry in the Thanksgiving game. So Vic took a page out of that playbook. And again, had it not been for just a quick hitting route, this could have also led to a sack. And, we want to highlight it because, the next play we're going to show of Vic came in the third quarter. He kind of pulls off this same move.
I want to get to that
Bailey.
play, but in a second, man, I just want people to pay attention to Devondre Campbell in this play. And it's just fun to watch Devondre Campbell completely oblivious to what's happening behind him until the play it's over. Just classic Devondre Campbell. But let's fast forward to sort of the big play that Vic Beasley made, which was that sack strip at the start of the third quarter.
So again, that just to talk a little bit more about that last play, those are the types of things that aren't going to show up in a box score as far as, Vic beating his man. But that's why I think that the whole ESPN pass rush win metric that's become pretty popular and something I've shared quite a bit comes into play, because if you're beating guys like that consistently, you're doing your job. It's just a matter of, how the play was designed, or maybe the coverage wasn't as good. And that's why, Takk McKinley hasn't had quite the numbers, but he's pulling off moves like that. So again, here's the one third quarter that led to the strip sack, and Vic pulls off this same move basically against Dennis Daly. Again, I guess you should put a little disclaimer on it. It's a rookie left tackle, 4th or 5th round pick. But beggars can't be choosers, and there was countless opponents where we said, oh, the matchup was ripe for Takk and Vic to go off, and they didn't. So to actually see this and actually see Vic putting together moves, and he was even stacking some inside moves he did later in the game on Taylor Moton from the right side. So this was truly a great game for Vic. Deserves highlighting. He's dealt with a lot of grief from us included, the fans. But this was truly a special performance from him. Good to see it. Again, Vic goes off against the Carolina Panthers, whatever it is about them. 7 of his 35.5 career sacks have come against the Panthers. If only we can get him to play like this against all the opponents. This is kind of the stuff that, led us to believe when we drafted him 8th overall that he could be, a talented pass rusher. So we'll see if it was just a one-hit wonder. It probably was, but it was nice to see him actually executing some pass rush moves in this game. And get the production to come with it.
Look, Vic Beasley certainly is deserving of a lot of criticism that he's got. I think he tends to get over criticized for certain things that I don't think he deserves in certain regards. But if you're of the mindset that hey, Aaron, he beat Dennis Daly, who's terrible, who's a backup guy that should be like a 4th tackle. It's like beating Ty Sambrailo. You're absolutely right, but that's what he did in 2016. So this notion that that type of performance is not in him, we saw that on this past Sunday. And so it is one of those things where I do feel like we all sort of know what Vic Beasley is. He is at best a complimentary pass rusher. And I think he showed that at times. And so for him to have a couple of positive moments this season, the last thing I'll say is, talking about his positive moments, what's going to be lost in a lot of the Vic Beasley hate this season is that he's actually played better in 2019 than he did in 2018. Now, he hasn't made the massive leap that would save Dan Quinn's job as so many people thought and expected him and wanted him to single-handedly come in here and get 12 to 15 sacks and single-handedly lead this pass rush into greatness that I think were some of the expectations put on him. But he has played better this season than he did a year ago. So that all the talk of he doesn't put in the work or he doesn't put in the effort, again, that's the part where I feel like gets a little bit overrated at times. I think it's fair to question his work ethic, but he has been better this season. And I think Sunday's game is a good illustration of that at least for a handful of games this season, we have seen him sort of revert back to that 2016 Vic Beasley and be the guy that can dominate the Dennis Dalys and the Ty Sambrailos of the world as he did on Sunday.
Yeah, and maybe the one other positive takeaway too is, and I know you might have other thoughts based on your free agency thoughts, but we want Vic to play as well as he can here in these last couple of weeks to kind of increase his value. Because again, he's likely not going to be coming back to Atlanta, but hopefully some team is willing to give him a pretty nice payday and could improve that comp pick, for the Falcons in 2021. Because again, as I touched earlier on the show, I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to be, even with a new regime. I think they're going to kind of, get their ducks in a row more so than be spenders and retool this roster. And the types of signings you should expect are the types of signings we've had the last couple of years as far as the mid-tier guys. And just, the hope is that, you're not just throwing money just to throw it around, and you're actually being smart about it and getting guys, fill certain roles. So again, if Vic Beasley continues to play well and show some improvement, because again, that was a move I haven't seen Vic Beasley pull in his entire career. So if he can continue to show that progression, some team will pay him. Pass rushers always get paid, whether they deserve it or not. And, again, that'll, benefit the Falcons in the long run. So, fans should be hoping to see more of this Vic Beasley these last couple of weeks. Again, it's going to be a tough matchup for him going up against McGlinchey and Joe Staley. But, maybe the last couple of weeks against Tampa, against Jacksonville, we can see more of this Vic Beasley, and he can finish with, I don't know, maybe 8-9 sacks. So,
yeah. So this is the time where we want to open the floor to you guys to get your thoughts. Before, if you're watching the show live on YouTube, you can see a link in the YouTube chat that allows you to join us either via computer, via mobile. All we ask is that if you're watching us live, to mute the show so that we don't get that sort of echo and get those delay issues from an audio standpoint, for the good of all listeners. But before you guys jump in, do want to give you guys a moment that if you haven't liked or subscribed to Pro Football Central, definitely like this video, share it with your fellow fans and fellow viewers and fellow listeners. And of course, subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page. We're going to talk a little bit more about this upcoming 49ers matchup, as Matt mentioned. And, this is an opportunity for you guys to come in and talk about whatever topics you want to talk about, ask your questions. Matt, I'm curious to sort of looking ahead to this 49ers matchup. We know the 49ers are pretty beat up. My boy Ben Garland is going to be front and center with Weston Richburg out. We know Richard Sherman's been beat up, but because Calvin Ridley is not going to play, that kind of mitigates that injury to a certain extent. But we'll see sort of what the Emmanuel Mosleys and the K'Wan Williams. I think K'Wan Williams is also pretty nicked up as well. So that's a situation. D Ford is nicked up. Obviously, we had the Trufant injury. Obviously, we have some of the injuries on the offensive line that the Falcons are dealing with Carpenter and the concussion and whatnot. So, both teams are pretty beat up. That helps the Falcons to a certain extent, but because they have some of these injuries that we talked about earlier, not to the degree where I think it really does a lot to close the gap between these two teams within, 11-2. What are the 49ers right now?
11-2, yeah. 11.5 point favorites too. They opened up as on Sunday. I don't know if that has changed since that day, but that's the highest line that the 49ers have gotten all season. So certainly Vegas doesn't respect the Falcons in this matchup. Don't necessarily blame them. I think this is a tough matchup. That the D line for me, the trench battle, as we often talk about on the show, the trench battle is going to be on the forefront of my mind, watching this game. Guys like Eric Armstead in a contract year, big fan of him. He's having a career year. You can't forget about DeForest Buckner. He hasn't had quite the season, which I've been a little surprised by, that he had last year, but certainly someone to watch for. And again, I have no idea who's going to be playing left guard for the Falcons this week, because Schweitzer left the game with an injury. We'll have to monitor the practice reports on that this week, because if he can't go and Carpenter can't clear concussion protocol, Atlanta Falcons legend John Wetzel is going to have to go up against Armstead and Buckner. So that's a scary thought for sure. So we'll see what happens there, because that's where my attention is going to lie. That's it. The only way the Falcons can win this game, is if they have a great performance from their offensive line. Maybe shades of that Washington Redskins matchup from last year, when the Redskins had a pretty good offensive line, and and defensive line, and the Falcons controlled the line of scrimmage battle and kind of ran it down their throats. If we can get a performance like that, and you're probably going to have to get even a better performance because the 49ers defensive line's even better than that Redskins unit was. That's the type of game that it's going to take to win here. I mean, you're almost going to have to play a ball control style approach, low scoring game.
That's always great with this Falcons defense, low scoring type of game.
Yeah. So again, the formula was like that Saints game was in week 9 or whatever after the bye. That's the type of performance, and maybe they can surprise the 49ers like they did the Saints. But again, I don't see it in their future. The one other thing, I'd want to highlight too is taking care of the football. I mean, we saw it, in these 2 Panthers games, they were +8 in the turnover margin. If you take those 2 games out, the Falcons are -15 on the season, which would be worst in the league. So taking care of the football, it's a cliche, but it'll be important in this matchup just because, again, the 49ers are really good at taking it away. They're 4th best in takeaways at 25. So, that'll be another key. If they can avoid the turnovers and maybe cause a few, then who knows? Again, the turnover margin is always so critical. And that's the way you steal games, is if you can win that battle. So those are the 2 things right now that, I'm kind of most looking forward to, and I think will determine the outcome of this game.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you talk about that Saints game. I think one of the key differences and one of the reasons why, I think a lot of people will be like, well, we beat the Saints. That was on the road and they were like 12-point favorites or whatever. We can do it again. I think the critical difference is, even if everything goes the Falcons' way early in the game like it did then, this 49er team is not built offensively the same way as the Saints were. The Saints are a dink and dunk offense. And it's one of those things where it's hard for them to get back into games because they don't really have an explosive offense. The 49ers are the polar opposite. They're one of the most explosive offenses in the league. And you saw that if you watched that Saints game this past Sunday, where like on the first drive after the Saints went down the field and scored, Jimmy Garoppolo's first 3 plays went 75 yards, right? Where he just basically boom, and they put them right in scoring position. And they scored like 2 plays later. Then at the start of the second quarter, on their sort of second touchdown drive, he hit a big play to Emmanuel Sanders, 75-yard touchdown. This 49er team, even if the Falcons come out there and play that ball control type of offense and are able to get off to a fast start and control the clock and do what they did against the Redskins, I think that's a good point, Matt, where they were able to run the ball and then also were able to pick apart that Redskins defense with their play action passing, which I think is a formula for success. It's going to be really hard for this Falcons defense to be able to limit the big plays. It's one of those things where we know that Kyle Shanahan knows this defense, the ins and outs of this defense. They play a similar defense in San Francisco. He's going to have plays designed to attack this team. You deal with the injuries in the secondary that the Falcons have, where they're going to have a lot more issues matching up one-on-one against Emmanuel Sanders. That's who Desmond Trufant would be covering if he was healthy for this game. You have Deebo Samuel, who, will play inside and outside. And obviously you're dealing with George Kittle, who is, looking like the best tight end in the league. I'm sure there's some people in Kansas City that would disagree with that take, but outside of that,
they'd be wrong though. George Kittle is tight end 1.
Yeah. I mean, outside of that 100-mile radius outside Kansas City, I don't know how many people would argue against that. We saw Ricardo Allen have some struggles against Jared Cook and Ian Thomas the last couple of weeks. We know Devondre Campbell has not looked as good covering tight ends this season. So you have these really bad matchup issues with the Falcons, so that even if they do start the game in a perfect way, everything sort of points in the favor of the 49ers being able to get back into the game. And so I think they're going to need a big boost from probably the third phase of the game, which is special teams, which is maybe get a big play. I know Deontay Harris had a big return that set up a Saints score early in that game. We know Young Wei Koo has had some success. Maybe they got to steal a possession with an early onside and maybe catch the 49ers off guard to just try to get something. I don't expect the Falcons to play that type of aggressive type of football.
Yeah, I mean, you reminded me of, and we didn't talk about it, but I kind of do want to go on a little bit of rant about Dan Quinn's decision on his fourth down. I mean, the lack of aggressiveness there. So yeah, I'd be very shocked if he pulls out the aggressive card here, but I certainly agree with you. I think that's the way you have to win this game, is steal possessions, be as aggressive as possible, because you're right, this could get ugly. The matchup is not good for the Falcons.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where it's going to be a tough matchup, but there is a pathway, there is a formula for success. Again, it's that ball control, keep that 49ers offense off the field, get them behind, so make it so that Kyle Shanahan is looking for those big explosive plays, and then maybe that gives your pass rush extra time to get after Jimmy Garoppolo and maybe Grady Jarrett, going against Mike Person, going against Ben Garland, is wrecking those guys. You maybe get some bad throws by Garoppolo, a couple of turnovers, a couple of big plays on special teams. But we talk about the offense with getting the ball out quickly and running the football, not two strengths of this offense this year, or getting the ball out quickly is something that they do well. What I meant to say was getting yards after the catch, because you just can't simply just dink and dunk your way, getting 6 yards at a time. Eventually that's going to, run out the closer and closer you get to the end zone. And we haven't been a great red zone offense this year, haven't done a great job finishing drives in that regard. So two areas where this team has not shown great ability so far this season, running the football, generating yards after the catch, is going to have to change if this team is going to have really much of a shot going up against this 49er team on the road. So certainly there is a pathway to success, but just based off of the Falcons' 2019 body of work, I wouldn't be overly optimistic that they will be able to achieve that. But certainly, there will be nothing better than to see this team have two very surprising performances on the road, just to at least give us some entertainment value, to at the very least be competitive going into the fourth quarter, so that we can not be completely checked out of this game by halftime, which, sitting here today, I think is likely to be the outcome, but maybe I'll be wrong about that.
Yeah, and I mean, to have the bragging rights not only over Saints fans once this year, but to have it over Kyle Shanahan, I'm sure will make Falcons Twitter rejoice a little bit. But I mean, yeah, Jimmy G, he has 11 picks too. So again, forcing him into a mistake or two, it's not out of the ordinary for him. So I think, again, playing that ball control, making them have to use those explosive plays, I think is an avenue where you can force the opposing quarterback into a mistake. So again, ball control, steal possession or two, and being able to protect Matt Ryan, and at least establish somewhat of a running game so that they can't pin their ears back. Because if this D-line could pin their ears back, I fear for Matt Ryan's safety a bit, especially given some of the injuries. And this might be the first game Chris Lindstrom plays a full game, so if this is a close ball game going into the fourth quarter, I worry a little bit what the conditioning and stamina is like, because I think that's kind of what we saw a little bit with Caleb McGarry in that Thanksgiving game, is the Falcons, had 90 total offensive plays, and the fourth quarter came, and we knew that they were going to have to drop back and throw, and I think Caleb got a little winded there, and that's why you saw him take advantage of by an All-Pro. So that certainly could happen with Lindstrom inside against either Armstead or Buckner. So again, offensive line is going to have a huge game. And the defense is going to have to find, defensive special teams going to have to find a way to steal some possessions on this team, because I wouldn't be shocked if this score was ugly and you're looking at like a 30 something to like 13 or 16 type of game.
If they only give up 30 points to this 49ers offense, that's kind of a win for this defense,
right? Yeah, I mean, it could be 40. It could be 40.
Yeah, I mean, like it's one of those things where, looking at this team, I think we're going to kind of know in the first quarter of a half whether or not this is a game, because they're going to have to get off to a fast start. They're just not going to be able to, ease into this game. It's just going to be like, okay, like they got off to a good start. They're making the 49ers play left-handed. And maybe that buys them a quarter or two where maybe they can make it a game going into the second half. And who knows if the 49ers start pressing and whatnot. So I think we're going to know pretty much by like 2:00 sort of whether or not, like if you have plans.
4 or 5 o'clock. I think this is a 4:00 game, right?
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's in San Francisco. So we'll know by 5:30 whether you guys can check out or continue watching.
Go do something else with your Sunday. Have a nice dinner with your loved ones or something like that. So if you have evening plans for Sunday night, don't cancel them on the Falcons' sake. We do have a couple of questions from the chat. Sensei asks, how do you guys feel about Matt Gano?
There were some highs and the lows from this past week, but he's certainly someone to continue to develop. Maybe he's potentially an answer at left guard to solve the left guard issue, in 2020 and beyond. I still like him best at that swing tackle. But I liked what I saw in certain aspects. I mean, pass pro, again, he's going to take some bumps, but he was displacing guys in the run game, which is good to see, and we haven't seen much of. So, yeah, I want to see more of him, and who knows, maybe he's the guy that's up at left guard in place of the injured Schweitzer and Carpenter if Carpenter can't go again.
Yeah, I liked what I saw from Gano. He was a guy that was using his length effectively to kind of jump set guys at the snap and redirect those guys. And then because of his athleticism, he was able to sort of adjust a little bit. Even if that initial sort of jump set didn't work, he can sort of recover a little bit. And I think, looking at watching the film of Caleb McGarry versus Jake Matthews, I think that's been one of the big issues that Jake Matthews has had a lot of success with. Jake Matthews doesn't have the longest arms, but he's able to recover because of his athleticism. I think one of the issues Caleb McGarry's been dealing with this season is if he doesn't win that initial engagement, he hasn't really shown the athleticism to really recover. And we saw that, be exposed quite a bit last week with Cameron Jordan, where if he sort of beat him initially off the snap, it was pretty much a wrap at that point in time. And I think that's the thing that you like about Gano, which again was why he's has such potential as a swing tackle. But again, I think using that length on the interior, it can be very effective against D tackles who aren't typically going to, they're going to try to rely on power and whatnot to sort of get into your pads. And if he can sort of shield those guys away with his length, it does make him an effective interior option, which I was skeptical of, after watching him these last couple of summers, being like, I think he's a better tackle than a guard. And I don't know if he's ideal for that, but I thought he played really well. I thought he did a great job on several plays, blocking on the second level. And that's been something that Matt and I have talked about, sort of how you can help unlock this running game. That Freeman touchdown run, he had this sort of the key block on Shaq Thompson there. Saw some positive plays for Lindstrom also on the second level as well. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you had, interior guys that are much better blocking on the second level than guys like Carpenter and Brown. And suddenly the Falcons running game looked a lot better in addition to, the individual effort made by running backs like Devontae Freeman and whatnot. But I liked a lot of Gano, and I'm intrigued to sort of see if he can get more work the rest of the season, particularly as a guard, and see if he can add that versatility and potentially be in the mix next season for a potential starting spot on the interior if, depending on what the Falcons can do. I think if he can play well, I think the panic that people have about the offensive line and feeling like they need to make dramatic changes this offseason to improve the offensive line, I think, it is a gamble, certainly if you don't make a major investment there, outside the draft. But I feel like the pieces are in place.
I mean, aren't you at the point where you don't want to spend any more in free agency on the offensive line?
I think that's kind of, if I'm being
so
honest,
I would hit the panic button if we don't see at least an offensive line draft pick within the first 3 rounds, then it's certainly a risk. But I agree. I think there's pieces. I mean, again, you got a guy in Gano you want to see more of. And, I find it hard to believe. I don't think they're going to go back to Jamon Brown anymore, especially with Lindstrom now going to get a full workload probably starting this week. So really the question mark right now is at left guard. And again, if I was a betting man, I'd say you probably see James Carpenter if he's healthy again, just because it seems like, again, they trust him, whether that's right or wrong. I'd say it's wrong, but they trust him and we're probably going to see him. But if we don't see him, then again, I'd love to see Matt Gano now at left guard and see what you have there, because he certainly could maybe be the answer there for 2020. So, again, I hope they just wait it out as far as what they do in 2020 until the draft. At this point, sinking money into free agency is not likely going to fix the offensive line, at least the money that they can afford. It's not going to fix the offensive line. The only way they're going to continue to improve this unit is through high draft picks.
Yeah. And, I think, and we certainly will, I'm sure, have plenty of conversations about this in the offseason. But one will have to sort of have a conversation about how much of the struggles of the offensive line is due to injuries. We know Carpenter missed most of the summer, been dealing with a hip injury. We know Brown has been nicked up, most games, finished maybe 4 games this season where he didn't at least avoid lose at least one snap to an injury. We know Alex Mack's been dealing with that elbow injury. Who knows sort of what other issues Caleb Gary's been dealing with in addition to his heart issue that he dealt with in the summer. Schweitzer's just got nicked up. Lindstrom's been nicked up. So, I think it is a gamble, as I said, to sort of basically let's run it back with the same group of guys. And if it doesn't work out, then, Matt Ryan gets hit another 120 plus times, which you don't want to see. But it is one of those things where I don't think I would begrudge the next regime to basically say, look, they've already put all this money into this group. Let's add a young center to groom behind Alex Mack. But like the 9 or 10 guys that they already have, maybe minus Sambrailo, is a good enough group that, if they can go out and hire a good offensive line coach, that he can make that unit gel. We see that with like Denver when they went out there and got Mike Munchak to help coach up some of the guys, and it's paid off for a guy like Garrett Bowles, who was really struggling mightily for the last couple of years. And I haven't checked to see what his Pro Football Focus grades, but I know certainly early in the season he was grading out much better than what he had done in the past. So that is a strategy. I know that's not going to necessarily sit well with people, but given how this offensive line has played, and certainly I understand that. But I do feel like they don't necessarily need to panic with the investments already made on this offensive line. They can't completely ignore it, as Matt said. I do think they need to go out there and get another interior option in the draft, particularly a guy that can be the heir apparent to Alex Mack at the center position. But I certainly think there is a case to be made for running it back with the same group and expecting better results next year.
Yeah, and I also wonder too how much the scheme could help the offensive line as well. And we're going to see a classic example of that, or at least maybe not this week, but if you go back and look at past 49ers games, I mean, Kyle Shanahan does a great job helping out his offensive linemen. I mean, I think that's the only way a guy like Daniel Brunskill can step in, former practice squatter for the Falcons, and actually look like a competent tackle and not get left at an island at times. Certainly helping him in the run game. He was a guy that filled in, for those that don't know, he was a guy that filled in for Joe Staley at left tackle, even Mike McGlinchey at right tackle. Both of those guys have been banged up this season. Kyle Shanahan's a perfect example. And again, maybe he's not the perfect example just because he's the best play caller and in football, in my opinion. But it's an example of where the scheme can help your deficiencies in the offensive line. So I think that's why, again, I've been kind of pushing a little bit of the offensive-minded guy for head coach, because I think that's your best shot, at least retaining it and having stability there as far as helping out your offensive line more. So again, that's a question I also have too with the offensive line, that maybe it's not all the talent. I'm sure that plays a part in it, but also the scheme helping them out. Because again, I'm with you. I would be somewhat fine if, Jake Matthews is their starting left tackle, obviously next year. I've been pretty adamant trying to slide Jamon Brown over to left guard. Maybe he battles with Matt Gano. You have Alex Mack for one more year. You draft his heir apparent to back him up. So that would be the backup center. You have Lindstrom at right guard. You have McGailey at right tackle. And then, again, it's just a matter of depth at that point. I'm okay re-signing Wes Schweitzer to be like that ninth offensive lineman, that second backup interior guy. You have Gano either being a swing guy or, again, maybe he's the starting left guard. And then maybe you just have to add one more body. So that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if that's what they did. So basically it would just be one draft pick, locked in for Alex Mack's future successor. So I don't think they have to totally blow up this offensive line by any means. I think the core group is there. You just have to continue to build upon it, especially with that left guard and center. But I think they have enough pieces there for 2020. Again, we're not going to see what we saw, in my opinion, if they go the offensive, guru route and the scheme is better and then they help out these guys up front.
Yeah. And if the Falcons didn't have so many other needs, maybe I would probably be a lot less willing to let the offensive line slide in the way that we just sort of talked about. But I think going back to Daniel Brunskill, I want to say that I was a big fan of Brunskill when he was here in Atlanta. I saw a lot of potential, and I would personally argue
he had potential for sure. But he
was very rough around the edges. Yes, yeah. That is very fair. However, I would sort of argue that two things that I constantly am pounding the table for why he has improved is one, he got to play in the AAF this past spring. And I do think we've seen, and I always bring these guys up as examples, guys like Harvey Dahl and Tyson Clabo spent time on the practice squad, went to NFL Europe, and then the next year they were starting games for the Falcons. And I continue to stress that a lot of these positions, guys need reps, and you don't get them in practice being on the practice squad. You don't get them being a second or third stringer on teams in practice during the season. You need these reps, and just basically going from the preseason in August to OTAs in April with not really getting any valuable reps is one of the reasons why it's so hard to develop guys. And I think offensive line is among those positions. The second point I would bring up is I think that you can at least use that as evidence to suggest that maybe Chris Morgan and this coaching staff aren't the greatest developers of talent when it comes to the offensive line, which then again goes to sort of what you're talking about with changes in scheme, but also changes in coaching, and hoping that you could see big leaps for guys like Gano and Lindstrom and McGarry next season with the new coaching staff. Again, we've seen teams like New Orleans does a great job developing. Munchak was a guy I mentioned. Obviously, the guy Dante Scarnecchia in New England has done an outstanding job. Bill Callahan's another coach that is a very reputed, great offensive line teacher. You see the work he's done in Dallas and Washington over the years. So it is one of those things where you hire the right offensive line coach and just saying, because I know in some alternate reality where Dante Scarnecchia leaves New England and comes to Atlanta, which we certainly aren't living in that reality, but he would just basically look at it like, I can work with this. I can coach up these guys. Like, that's how Alex Gibbs was. Like, yeah, I can work with this and I can coach up these guys. That's what Tom Cable thought he could be in Seattle. That didn't prove to be the case. But like, good offensive line coach would be like, yeah, there's more than enough talent with the players that the Falcons have that I can get this group to play well at a reasonably high level. And my hope is that whoever the Falcons wind up hiring next year as the head coach will bring an offensive line coach that has that same sort of background and reputation and is a proven guy that has been able to do that. So I think the offensive line, there's reason to be somewhat optimistic. Certainly a lot of reasons to be skeptical about that, but I do think people may want to not panic about how problematic the offensive line is. And that will be an interesting conversation to go back to what we talked about with Thomas Dimitrov, where if a year from now we're having a conversation about, hey, this offensive line was one of the most improved units for this 2020 Falcons team, does that wind up being, again, more of an indictment of Dan Quinn and his coaching staff than it necessarily does the guy who arguably, was responsible for signing those guys?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly kind of confirm what you're saying there. I think, again, I look at the money aspect of things a lot. And I think, where, I panic with the offensive line is just the money that's being sunk into it, and you're not getting that ROI. But again, if the same group of guys is back, then you'd kind of be left with no choice. If they're playing much better under a new coaching staff, you'd be left with no choice than to say, yeah, Dan Quinn and Chris Morgan and those guys were more at fault than Thomas Dimitrov. So it's certainly fascinating to watch. I think we said on last week's show, the offensive line coach hire is equally as important as whoever the next head coaching hire is, because it's one of the more important coaches on any staff. I mean, they're kind of coordinating the run game in addition to coaching up those offensive linemen. So that'll be certainly something to keep an eye on and see who makes up that future staff.
Absolutely. We got another question from Cody Stokes, and I think this is one that you talked about earlier, Matt.
Yeah, we mentioned Mike McDaniel as an offensive coordinator. I'm worried he wouldn't get to leave San Francisco for that job. He's pseudo acting in that role in San Francisco as the run game coordinator. So I don't know if, one of the rules, I think, as far as head coaching or coaching hires, assistant coaching hires, is unless it's for promotion, teams can block. Am I right on that?
I believe that's the way the rule works, but there are probably some nuances that we're forgetting.
So
I don't know.
Under that assumption, if that's true, then again, I don't know if this would classify as a promotion. And at that point, Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers can block. I know they blocked the Green Bay Packers last year for interviewing Mike McDaniel and Matt LaFleur's brother, Mike LaFleur, who's also on that 49ers staff. So again, that's the one thing I'd caution fans. I get a lot of times in my mentions about certain coaches becoming offensive coordinators for the Falcons, future offensive coordinators. And, I pump the brakes on some of those takes just because, again, in a lot of those situations, those guys won't be able to leave their current team for that type of opening. If it was for a head coach, which we've speculated with Mike McDaniel, I wrote about in my article at Rise Up Reader, that Mike McDaniel is one of those wild cards, one of those, doesn't have a lot of experience calling plays or leading a franchise, but of the wild cards, he's high on my list. I'm very intrigued by him. He's well regarded throughout league circles. He's been with Shanahan almost on every step of his journey. So he's surely soaking up a lot of that knowledge. So if he was that wild card head coach hire, I wouldn't be upset about it. But as far as offensive coordinator goes, I'm not sure he'd have that opportunity to leave San Francisco for an opportunity like that.
Yeah. I don't have anything else to add there. So ditto, I guess. Let's see.
When are you gonna, I guess, is it gonna be safe for that Black Monday show where you'll kind of give your takes? Because I know that's something you don't like to do too often, as far as who you'd like or who you'd be in favor of, and who you'd have to take a wait and see approach on.
I mean, honestly, I don't have any sort of like strong preemptive takes on that. Like, that's kind of it, where it's just like, if Arthur Blank wants to hire Mike McCarthy, it's like, okay, like there's positives and negatives to that. If he wants to hire Jim Harbaugh, there's positives or negatives. Like, to me, it's not, I don't really have like, this is my guy. This is the guy I want them to hire, because I think pretty much anybody you can poke holes in, or you can say, but here are the positives for this. Like, I learned many years ago, way back in 2007, where I was sitting there pounding the table for the Falcons need to hire Cam Cameron, the Chargers offensive coordinator, because he's done a great job with Phillip Rivers these last couple of years. He's ready to be a head coach. They wound up hiring Bobby Petrino. Cameron went to Miami, and the Dolphins went 1-15. He got fired, and then he wound up like being a bad offensive coordinator in LSU a couple of years later. And that taught me right there. It's like, oh, I have no clue who's a good head coach. I'm just sitting here looking at people's Pro Football Reference pages and Wikipedia pages and making a lot of assumptions. Maybe I read an article or two about how great this guy is and how wonderful he is to work with, but I have no idea who is a head coach. And frankly, when you look at around the league and how quickly, coaches get fired, and how, I don't think anybody really has a clue who has what it takes to be a good NFL head coach. You just kind of get lucky. It's kind of a gamble. So that's part of the reason why I don't have any real strong opinions, because it's like, it's not a skill set that I possess, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have any inkling of an idea sort of who would make a good Falcons head coach. If and when they start making some of their interviews, that's probably when I'll have stronger opinions. Right now I'm being like, I like this about that guy and I don't like this about that guy. But for the most part, for me, it's just kind of a wait and see approach. Okay. Well, guys, looks like no one wants to call in, which is fine. We're not going to take it.
We're getting towards the end. I'm with you, people. We're almost there. Finish lines. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Once the Black Monday show hits, we'll have, it's a new chapter. We'll have more stuff to talk about as far as speculating on the future. But yeah,
it is what it is. I just want to check to make sure. I think next week we're going to do a Monday show because Tuesday is Christmas Eve, if I'm not mistaken.
What's today? That's the 10th. So not next week, but the week after.
Yes,
next week, as usual, Tuesday show, but then the following is Christmas Eve. So we thought we'll do a Monday night show. Hoping to get a guest for that one, because that'll preview the regular season finale with the Bucs, and maybe look ahead to the draft a little bit. As a little potential spoiler, we got to see. We got to lock it in, but that's our plan there. And then obviously the week after that, New Year's Eve is Tuesday, so we want to do a Monday show, and that falls on Black Monday. So we're thinking we'll have some news to talk about and get into some of that, and again speculate more on the future of this team and organization. Yes,
so definitely we'll have plenty of takes this offseason, because I'm sure a lot will be happening in the coming weeks. We're, I think, slowly inching up on episode 300 on this show too, so that's right around the corner. So we might plan something big for that. I think that's going to hit sometime in second week of January or something like that. So stay tuned to that. You definitely want to check out Falcons PFC on Twitter to get those updates on the show. You definitely want to subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page. Make sure you hit that bell icon so that you get all the latest updates when we go live and whatnot. Check out profootballcentral.com if you want all the links to the audio version of the show. You can also check out the Falcons PFC Twitter page. The pinned tweet at the top will give you those links to various platforms like Apple, Google, Stitcher, and whatnot. And, you want to check us out on Twitter at FalcFans and at Matt Karoly. That's FALCFANS and MATTKAROLY. And Matt, you got any upcoming articles at Rise Up Reader that you want to plug, or some of your other recent stuff? I know you talked a little bit about an article you wrote.
Yeah, part 2 of my Falcon Out of the Future series. Part 1 was looking at future head coaching candidates, as I mentioned. Part 2, haven't, fully decided. I think I'm going to write on potential GM hires just because that's what the people want. But as I said earlier in the show, I'm not 100% confident we will have a new GM, but we'll look ahead to it, see what the possibilities. The other alternative was writing about free agency, which again, I don't expect them to be super active. So I don't know how much of a point there is, but part 3 will be on the draft, and that'll be, as we get into the winter and get closer to that time. So that's something else to look out for. But I'm hoping to have part 2 probably out by Christmas time is my hope. So riseupreader.com. Appreciate you guys always clicking that, sharing that, giving me feedback on that. So thanks, guys.
Yeah. Check us out on Facebook too, Falcon Central Radio. I know I forgot a plug there. So,
and we'll probably do, I guess, more videos on there as we get into the off season, like we did last year. We'll probably kind of hop on over there throughout the week if there's breaking news, just to give a quick little blurb. So that's one reason to be following there and checking that out. We don't do a lot of activity throughout the season, but during the off season, I think is where we'll pump out a lot of content there.
Absolutely. So guys, appreciate you. We'll be back next Tuesday. And we'll be talking about this 49er game. Hopefully it's not a disaster, and we'll get you guys geared up for the Gardner Minshew extravaganza that is the Week 16 matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars.